Hi, welcome back to the bunker. I'm John, your host, once again. Last time we talked about John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, which is the story of the wedding at Cana of Galilee, where Jesus first began to demonstrate his glory. And it ends in verse 11, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. Last time we talked about marriage, how Jesus supported marriage, and by going there, his first miracle was in a marriage celebration. He shows us that it's appropriate to delight in what is righteous and what is good. He wants us to be happy. He does tell us, you need to not do this, you need to not do that. Why? Because there are things that are destructive, that are wrong, that are rebellious against his authority, his love for us. He is in charge of the universe. There's an order to the universe. He created us, created man, created the angels, created the stars and the worlds, all the other worlds, everything. Not everything that was, let's see, I'm going to quote that wrong. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Everything that's been made, which is everything that is. And Hebrews says he made it from nothing. Not from things that do appear, but absolutely from nothing. By the word of his power he spoke, and it stood fast. So all these things were created for our good. The world was described by him through the 6 days of creation as being good, good, and very good. He created a beautiful place for us to live in. But I want to talk about one other thing. He creates all of this grape juice, which I've already argued is not alcoholic. Why? Well, because he talks about the leaven of sin. When he's talking about the Pharisees and their problems, decay is a parable for sin. The Old Testament talks about alcohol being mind-altering. It's not good for rulers, for kings to consume alcohol. He's about ready to perish. He's in great pain. Give him that if somebody's going to drink it. But it's not uplifting. It's not health-giving. But grape juice is very health-giving. So he... these water pots, 6 water pots of stone, 3 or 4 firkins apiece, and a lot of your Bibles will give you some equivalent to how many gallons it is. They're pretty big. So all of this grape juice he created, and it was better. It was the best grape juice anyone had ever tasted because it was miraculously created right then. And so what's interesting is the governor of the feast, the ruler of the feast, verse 9, he tasted the water that was made wine and knew not from whence it was, even though the servants knew. And the governor of the feast called the bridegroom and said, every man at the beginning does set forth good wine. When men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. Okay, this is very interesting because the governor of the feast says every man gives the good stuff first, and then kind of after you've consumed that and been impressed by what he had, then it kind of gets worse. Well, that is the nature of the world. That's the nature of what the devil does too. What you see to begin with seems pretty good. Well, that's the nature of temptation and sin. The bait looks really good, but then when you get caught, then you see that it's worse and worse, and it leads to death. God, on the other hand, works in exactly the opposite. He says, take up your cross and follow me, but what does he provide for us? If I go, I will prepare a place for you. If I go, I'll come again. I'm going to prepare mansions for you. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. So he is preparing a dwelling place for his people, that they may lie down in safety, that the lion and the lamb will lie down together, the lion will eat straw as the ox, the child will play on the den of the asp and the adder and not get stung. They'll not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. Excuse me. So there's a cross to bear. There's a work to be done on this earth, but there's a reward to follow. In other words, God gives his good things later. There are good things along the way, but it just gets better and better. The devil gives the best he can up front as bait to entice us to follow him, and then it gets worse. We realize it was a fraud, it was a facade, and what's behind is terrible. John Bunyan, in the classic work The Pilgrim's Progress, this book for hundreds of years was the second most influential book in Western culture, second only to the Bible. This was a mainstay of Protestantism for years. England broke away from Catholicism. They had some reform in their worship, but they were still oppressive to people that didn't agree with the state church. You had to have a license to preach. John Bunyan felt a call from God to preach. He preached, and he was thrown into Bedford jail because he didn't have a license to preach. He wrote this book from Bedford jail. And this is an allegory of the Christian's walk from the city of destruction to the celestial city, as he words it, and there are various characters that along the way and teach valuable lessons. Well, in this story, there are two brothers. One wants his good things now, but the other is willing to wait. The problem with having your good things now is first things give way to second things, or first things give way to last things, but last things don't give way to anything because they're last. So the one that was willing to have his reward at the end kept his reward forever. That's the analogy in that part of the book that John Bunyan is making, the difference between the worldly and the heavenly. The worldly is temporary. Yes, you might get more reward on the front end. You might live in greater comfort or have greater notoriety or wealth or power or whatever in the world for a very brief time, and then you die, and oops, you didn't lay up treasure for yourself in heaven, and that's the best you get. But if you're willing to wait for your good things, you will, like Paul said, you've laid up in heaven a crown of righteousness. Why? Because you've been faithful to the great King. And the great King wants you to be with him in his kingdom, and he wants you to rule with him. He said, come and sit down with me in my throne, even as I've overcome and sat down in my Father's throne. Wow! That the God of the universe, the great King who has made everything, wants to be intimate with us, to bring us into communion with himself. He does want to try us, to test us, to see if we'll be loyal, see if we just have come for the good things, for the loaves and the fishes, as when he was here on earth and he fed the 5,000, fed the 4,000 miraculously. Some came just for the miraculous food. They're like, oh wow, he can provide us just everything. Well, this is marvelous. They didn't want the spiritual teachings. They didn't want righteousness. They didn't want to overcome sin. They didn't want to be good. But that is the key that opens up the eternal blessings. God's not willing that sin shall be a blight to the universe forever. Nahum 1:9 says, there shall be an utter end. Sin shall not rise a second time. God has a solution to remove sin from the world, the rebellion from the world that's caused all the heartache and misery in the world. People say, oh, how could God, if he's powerful and loving, let all this misery happen? Why? Because he wants us to choose. He wants to give us freedom to act and choose. The devil, who was his head angel, covering cherub, right-hand man, chose to rebel against him, and he wants to force anyone he can to do his will. Force. He introduces force. Anyone who wants to introduce force is following the devil's example. Anyone. In any context, we are not to force the conscience of our fellow man. That is so important to God that we choose freely, that he's allowed us to do so and allowed 6,000 years of sin and misery because we've had an opportunity to choose, and so many of us have chose poorly. But even with that, he sent his son to die to pay the penalty so that we could have probation. We don't die immediately. We have a chance to choose, to think, to evaluate, to see, what is this one like? What is that one like? Which way am I going to go? And then if we surrender to him and say, that sin is terrible, I don't want to sin, please cover me with your blood that you shed for the remission of sins, for my salvation, then we can be with him in paradise forever. And what is that? That's the good things that come last, not first. So this principle that Jesus showed, even in this one miracle, by giving the wine that was better than what was there before, he's showing that heavenly things are in the opposite order of worldly things. What's my time? I'm just over 10 minutes, and so I'm going to close for today. Thank you for being with me, and thank you for walking with me through this parable as we're in chapter 2 of John. Until next time, I'm John at the bunker.